Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, America has emerged as the one and only military and economic superpower, championing capitalism with a quarter of the world's economy and half of its military expenditures. But here in New York, at the very epicenter of the financial meltdown, it all seemed to come to an end. Or to quote House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the party's over. Once the world's biggest creditor, the masters of the universe have become the world's largest debtors, $10, $11 trillion and counting. John Terrett assesses the greatest American decline since the Great Depression.
At the first attempt, legislators rejected the Bush administration's flawed plan to save Wall Street from its own excesses.
The legislation has failed.
But lawmakers came together as global calls for action rang loud. Many criticized America's lack of leadership for the toxic financial problem created in its own backyard. They needed to come together to avoid scenes not witnessed for almost a century. The causes are eerily similar. Small banks in the late 1920s overextended themselves by providing loans for homeowners. Those very same people could not repay their mortgages, sending banks numbering more than 1,000 to the wall. The Republicans then, like most Republicans in the House and the Senate today, held tight to the principle that government should not bail out any industry, especially those that write their own death wish. It took a Democrat, Franklin D. Roosevelt, to kickstart the U.S. economy in 1933. Roosevelt opposed the redistribution of wealth, but hit Wall Street with new regulations. The super rich paid more in tax. This could be a similar historic moment, the old guard swept aside by a new Democratic guard. Barack Obama doesn't have much of a record to date, but he connects the dots of financial failure to the Bush administration.
If your neighbor's house is burning, you're not going to spend a whole lot of time saying, well, that guy was always irresponsible. He always left the stove on. All those things may be true, but his house could end up affecting your house.
Many see President George W. Bush as a bystander, helplessly watching events unfold around him. He's left the running of his economy to his Treasury Secretary, Henry Paulson, the former Goldman Sachs CEO, and the Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke. Paulson has been accused of plucking the $700 billion bailout figure from thin air without proper consultation. He's also charged with bailing out his Wall Street chums. Paulson's one-knee begging gesture to House Democrat leader Nancy Pelosi has been met with derision. His inconsistent policies towards financial institutions have caused more panic, giving speculators free rein to bet on banks going bust. He saved Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, left Lehman Brothers to the wolves, and stepped in to seize control of Washington Mutual and the insurance giant AIG. The roots of this present crisis have been pinned on numerous people and the flawed system they created. Former President Ronald Reagan came to power promising to reduce taxes, reduce government spending, and interference in the economy. His form of Reaganomics powered Wall Street giants on a merger spending spree.
America's best days lie ahead.
Wall Street's successes gave Hollywood new material. Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko, the unscrupulous corporate raider, unleashed 3 words that encapsulated the 80s. Greed is good. But all that blew up in late 1987 with the markets crashing more than 20% in one day. The lessons of past excess and failure seem to have been lost on Wall Street. A new crisis came when ordinary Joes were encouraged to become property moguls with no hope of ever making their mortgage repayments. And a new adjective entered the lexicon: subprime. Many now face financial ruin. Banks were considered no less trustworthy than individual debtors and refused to loan money to each other, seizing up the whole banking industry. Leaders from around the world were quick to condemn Bush for his handling of the U.S. economy.
O ônus da cobiça desenfreada de alguns não pode recair impunemente sobre os ombros de todos.
Que ceux qui ont mis en danger l'argent des épargnants soient sanctionnés.
The Bush administration's $700 billion rescue package could prove to be a small band-aid if banks don't begin lending to one another again and to small businesses and homeowners. As the American dream turns into a nightmare, President Bush's pretensions to export democracy and capitalism have been dealt a severe blow. Many around the world may welcome American music, television, and food into their lives, but nobody has the stomach for America's latest export, debt and recession.
Welcome. To discuss the fallout in the U.S. economy, I have with me in the studio David Eisenberg, Professor Boyce Watkins, and of course, Peter Schiff. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter, I would like to start with you. Is this bailout constitutional?
Well, no, nothing the government does is constitutional these days. If we stuck to the Constitution, we wouldn't have these problems. But you know, in your introduction, the problem with it is it fails to recognize the root cause, both in the 20s and today, for the excesses on Wall Street. Sure, Wall Street got drunk, but it was the Federal Reserve that poured the alcohol. And you know, what we're having now is the bursting of that bubble that was created not only by the Federal Reserve and their inflationary monetary policy, but by the moral hazards of Freddie and Fannie that enabled so much debt to be piled on. And now our phony economy, which is made up of Americans borrowing trillions of dollars to just blow it on consumption, that whole economy is imploding. And also in your introduction, you know, you credit Roosevelt for getting us out of the Depression. It was the policies of Roosevelt and Hoover that caused the Depression. If the free market would have been allowed to function, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as bad. And that's the danger of what we're doing now with the bailout.
We're going to get to the free market, but if that is the case, then how do we explain? And let me quote this from Secretary of Treasury Paulson. He says that he would not be, or all of his decisions in the future with the $700 billion wouldn't be reviewable by any court of law or any administrative agency. He's going to actually have $700 billion to spend now.
Well, it's going to be more than that. It's going to be trillions. And he doesn't have any money to spend. The Federal Reserve is going to have to print it. I mean, maybe we can con the people in Saudi Arabia and China and Japan to lend us even more money. But if they don't want to do it, and they shouldn't, because we can't even pay back the money we've borrowed, let alone any new money that we can con people into lending us, we're just going to create inflation and destroy our currency.
Professor Watkins, I mean, what does this really mean? We still have the crisis, except it was moved from Wall Street to the main streets through Pennsylvania Avenue. But the crisis is still there, and now the American taxpayer is going to pay for it.
Let's be clear. This series of events was to some extent, the illegitimate love child between the American consumer and our culture of greed, excessive borrowing, excessive spending, undersaving, underinvesting, mixed with the quote-unquote financial drug dealers, which are our banks, which were operating in an environment that had far less regulation than it had in the past. So you were creating the recipe for disaster. Any good economist could have told you 5 years ago that this was going to happen. But one thing we have to understand is that this is a correction. It's clearly a correction, but a correction is not necessarily a crisis and a collapse. You know, everyone that's sort of doing the victory dance to say, oh, this is the end of the American economy, this is the collapse of capitalism, et cetera, that's going to be a short dance, because the truth of the matter is that we did strengthen our economy. We pumped it up like an athlete on steroids. We made some very bad decisions. We had some very bad leadership. And there will be a correction and a price to pay for that.
You think it's only a correction? You don't think there's an actual fallout?
No.
With trillions of dollars being lost?
No, I think that there's a problem. I think that this is the tip of the iceberg. If you really want to see the serious long-term problems of the American economy, you have to look deeper. You have to realize, for example, we're on the verge of one of the greatest retirement crises our country's ever seen. We have a lot of baby boomers that are about to retire who are not prepared to retire. And then you've got a dwindling youthful workforce, which is going to have an impact on the productivity of our country. And our young people are not prepared for globalization.
And you're right, but the problem is, you know, what the government is doing now is going to interfere with the free market trying to correct those problems. We need to rein in all the excess borrowing and spending. We have to start saving and producing. But this Paulson plan is specifically designed to prevent the free market from delivering that medicine that we badly need.
Actually,
and the real danger to the economy
David, it seems to me, and just to pick up on the drug metaphor, giving a corporate manager like Paulson $700 billion to spend on Wall Street, it's like giving the drug mafia to be in charge of the Drug Enforcement Agency in Washington.
Well, I'd say beyond that, it's a huge unknown leap into the abyss, right? Even if you think that Secretary Paulson is as smart as many of the pundits I listen to daily around Washington say he is, the fact of the matter is, you're dealing with imponderables that even, the Oracle of Delphi couldn't divine. Now, how are we supposed to assume that this one man, no matter how smart, whatever advisors and staff he has at his disposal, I'm sure there's some part people there, can possibly be in terms of trying to divine what are all the smart investments to make, what are the good things to buy, what are the bad things to buy. I mean, that seems beyond the bailiwick of any one
actually,
group
if I may,
small
that's
group
why
of
we need the
people.
free market.
Actually,
no one individual can do
we're going to go to the free market, but I don't understand. We still, you're a professor of finance. You know, I have my own PhD. I don't get it. I don't get what the problem is. How do we find a cure if we haven't even understood what the disease is?
Right,
I mean, if I don't get it, I'm sure President Bush doesn't get it.
Well, President Bush doesn't get much of anything. We pretty much established that. And what's really making this an interesting scenario is that we're dealing in an environment that we've never seen. We've never seen economies as integrated globally as they are right now. And so what might actually occur as natural capital flows from one country to another in response to economic conditions might appear to look as though the United States is in big trouble because money is moving from here to China and things like that. But the fact is that the Chinese borrow from us, we borrow from them. It goes back and forth. It's a global thing. So we have to understand we're operating in a new environment, so we're going to need new tools to solve new problems.